I was mixing concrete demolition charges in my garage when 20 SWAT officers surrounded my house with assault rifles. Margaret Stone had called in a terrorist threat because she thought my pool removal equipment was a bomb-making operation. What she didn't know was that I'm a certified explosive ordnance disposal specialist who'd been defusing actual bombs for the past 12 years. My name is Ethan Brooks, and I remove unexploded ordnance from military bases and construction sites for a living. But when Margaret, our HOA safety coordinator, I saw me using professional demolition techniques to break up my pool concrete. She didn't realize she was reporting someone whose job is literally preventing explosions from hurting people. Because while she was calling me a domestic terrorist, I was actually using the same precision demolition methods that had saved hundreds of lives in combat zones. And every suspicious explosive device, she reported, was equipment I used to make dangerous situations safe, not create them. We've all had neighbors who see danger in everything we do, right? The ones who call authorities about perfectly normal activities because they don't understand what they're looking at. As this story unfolds, you'll probably recognize the difference between genuine safety concerns and paranoid overreaction. What happened next will make you question everything you think you know about neighborhood watch vigilance. 3 months ago, I made the decision to convert my backyard pool into a workshop space for maintaining my EOD equipment. Working as an explosive ordnance disposal specialist requires precision tools and controlled environments that most commercial facilities can't provide. My current assignment involved clearing unexploded ordnance from construction sites where developers had discovered buried military artillery from World War II training exercises. The pool had been installed by the previous homeowner, but for someone who spends his days carefully dismantling explosive devices, it represented wasted space that could serve a critical safety function. My EOD equipment required climate-controlled storage, and the pool area provided the perfect location for a workshop where I could maintain the tools that kept construction workers and military personnel safe from explosive hazards. I obtained proper demolition permits from the city, but unlike typical pool removal, my approach involved using small shape charges to break up the concrete efficiently without damaging surrounding structures. Having spent 12 years in military explosive disposal, I knew exactly how to minimize risk while maximizing effectiveness. That's when Margaret Stone entered my life like an unexploded mine that had been waiting for someone to step on it. She appeared at my property line on the first morning I began preparing demolition charges. Carrying a tablet loaded with safety protocols and wearing the expression of someone who'd seen genuine danger and recognized it everywhere, Margaret was the type of authority figure who commanded respect through comprehensive knowledge rather than loud accusations. Mr. Brooks, I'm Margaret Stone, HOA Safety Coordinator and Community Emergency Preparedness Liaison, she announced, positioning herself to observe my equipment setup. I've received preliminary reports about unauthorized explosive materials being stored in a residential area. Margaret had the bearing of someone with extensive emergency response background, referencing specific federal regulations and safety protocols with the fluency of someone who'd been trained in explosive hazard recognition. What struck me as immediately concerning was her unusually detailed knowledge of explosive safety protocols that most civilians wouldn't possess. I understand your concerns about explosive materials, I replied, but I'm a certified EOD specialist with federal authorization to possess and use controlled demolition charges for legitimate purposes. She consulted her tablet and frowned with practiced authority. Mr. Brooks, residential areas require special consideration for explosive storage and use. Federal authorization doesn't supersede local safety protocols designed to protect community members from accidental detonation. I examined her documentation, noting that her safety concerns included accurate technical terminology about explosive device classification and storage requirements. Either she'd done extensive research on explosive safety, or she'd been trained by someone with professional explosive handling experience. Margaret, I'm curious about your background in explosive safety. Your knowledge of federal explosive storage regulations is unusually comprehensive for civilian emergency preparedness. Her confident expression flickered with something I'd learned to recognize during combat operations. The micro-expression of someone whose expertise came from personal loss rather than professional training. Community safety requires thorough understanding of all potential hazards. She deflected. I maintain professional relationships with appropriate emergency response authorities to ensure neighborhood protection. But professional relationships don't typically provide the detailed knowledge of explosive device classification and federal storage requirements that Margaret was demonstrating. My EOD training had taught me to recognize when someone's knowledge came from lived experience rather than academic study. Over the next week, Margaret's safety documentation campaign escalated with the systematic thoroughness of someone who understood exactly what evidence would convince authorities that a genuine threat existed. She photographed my equipment storage, documented chemical containers, and filed reports that contained precise technical specifications about explosive devices and safety protocols. Each report included accurate descriptions of EOD equipment, proper terminology for explosive materials classification, and detailed safety concerns that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of how explosive accidents occur. Someone had taught Margaret to recognize and document explosive hazards with professional-level expertise. The pattern triggered my professional instincts in ways that had nothing to do with neighborhood disputes and everything to do with understanding how people develop specific knowledge about explosive safety. I decided to apply the same investigative methodology I used for EOD assignments to understand exactly who I was dealing with and why her knowledge of explosive safety was so comprehensive. Using public records and professional databases, I began building a background profile of Margaret Stone's history and potential connections to explosive ordnance training. What I discovered explained everything about her reaction to my EOD equipment and demolished every assumption I'd made about her motivations. Margaret's husband, Staff Sergeant Michael Stone, had been killed by an improvised explosive device during his third deployment to Afghanistan 5 years ago. He'd been an EOD specialist attached to the 82nd Airborne Division, responsible for clearing roadside bombs and protecting convoy routes from explosive threats. The records showed that Michael had been killed while attempting to disarm a complex IED that had been designed specifically to target bomb disposal personnel. His death had been featured in military publications as an example of the sophisticated explosive threats that EOD specialists faced in combat environments. Margaret's comprehensive knowledge of explosive safety hadn't come from emergency preparedness training. It had come from living with an EOD specialist who'd taught her to recognize and understand the tools and techniques that kept people safe from explosive hazards. But it had also come from losing someone she loved to the very explosives that my profession was designed to neutralize. The revelation hit me like discovering that your safety coordinator isn't paranoid, but traumatized by the same explosive hazards you work with every day. I immediately understood why Margaret's reaction to my EOD equipment had been so intense and technically informed. She wasn't seeing a neighbor using professional demolition techniques. She was seeing the same equipment and materials that had surrounded her husband before an explosive device killed him. Every shaped charge I mixed reminded her of the tools Michael had used to protect his unit. Every chemical container in my storage area looked identical to the supplies he'd maintained for EOD operations. My professional demolition work was triggering memories of the explosive ordnance disposal career that had taken her husband's life. The psychological impact was staggering. Margaret wasn't filing safety reports because she was controlling or paranoid. She was filing them because she'd been trained by an EOD specialist to recognize explosive hazards, and she was genuinely terrified that the same equipment that had failed to protect her husband might hurt someone else in our community. I called Dr. Linda Hayes, a military family therapist I'd worked with during post-deployment counseling, to understand how EOD family members process the loss of loved ones to explosive devices. Ethan. Military spouses develop sophisticated understanding of their partner's work as a coping mechanism, Linda explained. When EOD specialists are killed by explosive devices, their families often experience hypervigilance about explosive safety that can persist for years. Linda, I'm dealing with someone whose husband was killed by an IED, and she's seeing my legitimate EOD work as a potential threat to community safety. Ethan, that's textbook trauma response. She's not being malicious. She's trying to prevent other people from experiencing the loss she's endured. Her technical knowledge makes her believe she can identify and prevent explosive tragedies. Linda's explanation crystallized what my professional empathy should have recognized immediately. Margaret's enforcement actions weren't about controlling neighborhood activities. They were about protecting our community from the explosive hazards that had destroyed her family. But understanding Margaret's trauma didn't change the fact that her safety reports were becoming increasingly desperate and technically detailed. She'd begun filing formal complaints with federal authorities, Using the legitimate threat reporting protocols that military families learn for identifying potential security risks, her latest report to the FBI's Joint Terrorism Task Force contained detailed photographs of my EOD equipment, accurate technical descriptions of explosive materials, and comprehensive documentation that made my legitimate professional activities appear suspicious to investigators who didn't understand the context. The irony was heartbreaking. Margaret was using the same attention to detail and technical expertise that her husband had taught her to protect people from explosive threats. But she was applying that knowledge to someone whose mission was identical to her husband's, keeping people safe from explosive hazards. I faced a choice that had no clear precedent in either EOD protocols or neighborhood dispute resolution. I could continue my pool demolition and trigger someone who'd lost her husband to explosive devices. Or I could find a way to help Margaret understand that my work represented safety rather than danger. The decision was made for me when Margaret's latest federal report triggered an automatic investigation protocol that would bring explosive ordnance disposal experts and federal agents to our quiet suburban neighborhood. Her final safety report had contained enough technical detail and legitimate-sounding evidence to convince federal investigators that a potential domestic terrorism threat existed in our community. She'd followed the exact protocols that military spouses learn for reporting suspicious explosive activities, and those protocols were designed to trigger immediate law enforcement response. That's when I realized Margaret's trauma-driven safety campaign had accidentally created the very explosive situation she'd been trying to prevent. Her reports would bring armed federal agents to our neighborhood, creating exactly the kind of dangerous confrontation that her husband had died trying to prevent. But what Margaret didn't understand was that her technical knowledge of explosive safety, combined with her genuine fear for community welfare, had made her the most credible witness federal investigators could encounter. Every detail she documented matched the evidence patterns that terrorism task forces use to identify legitimate threats. The woman who'd been trying to protect our neighborhood from explosive hazards was about to trigger a federal response that would put every resident in potential danger, and the only person who could prevent that escalation was the EOD specialist she'd been reporting as a terrorist threat. Tomorrow morning, her final report would reach federal investigators who specialized in explosive threats, and unless I could find a way to help Margaret understand that we were both trying to protect people from the same explosive hazards that had killed her husband, our quiet suburban community was about to become the center of a federal terrorism investigation that would traumatize everyone involved. The federal response came at 5:47 a.m. on a Thursday morning. I was reviewing EOD safety protocols in my kitchen when unmarked vehicles began positioning themselves throughout our neighborhood. FBI Joint Terrorism Task Force agents, Explosive Ordnance Disposal Specialist, and local SWAT teams coordinated what would become the largest domestic terrorism investigation our suburban community had ever experienced. The operation was a masterclass in federal coordination, designed to neutralize potential explosive threats while protecting civilian populations. Mobile command units established encrypted communication networks, while bomb squad specialists prepared equipment for safely assessing and securing dangerous materials. Emergency evacuation routes were mapped for every household within a quarter-mile radius. Agent Rebecca Martinez from the FBI's Counterterrorism Division called my cell phone as tactical officers established perimeter control around my property. Mr. Brooks, this is Agent Martinez with the Joint Terrorism Task Force. We need you to exit your residence immediately and follow specific evacuation procedures for your safety and the safety of federal personnel. I could see neighbors gathering at their windows, confusion and fear evident, as they watched 20 heavily armed officers surround what they'd considered a quiet residential street. The sight of tactical vehicles, bomb disposal robots, and federal investigation equipment transformed our suburban paradise into what appeared to be an active terrorism scene. I stepped onto my front porch with my hands visible, immediately recognizing the professional competence of officers who'd been briefed to expect a potential explosive threat. 20 SWAT officers in tactical gear had positioned themselves with sight lines covering every exit route, while explosive ordnance specialists prepared equipment for what they expected to be a dangerous situation. The tactical formation was textbook perfect for neutralizing explosive threats. Snipers had established overwatch positions while entry teams prepared for potential forced evacuation of dangerous materials. Bomb disposal robots waited nearby, ready to assess suspicious devices without risking human lives. Officers, I'm Ethan Brooks, certified EOD specialist with federal clearance. I called out. I believe there's been a misunderstanding about the nature of my explosive materials and equipment. Captain James Wilson, the SWAT team leader, approached with the cautious respect of someone who dealt with genuine explosive threats and understood the difference between neutralizing dangers and creating them. His tactical vest bore patches indicating extensive experience with counter-terrorism operations and explosive device disposal. Mr. Brooks, we've received detailed reports about suspicious explosive activity and bomb-making materials. We need to verify your credentials and secure any potentially dangerous devices. The reports Captain Wilson referenced contained photographs and technical descriptions that would have convinced any reasonable investigator that a legitimate threat existed. Margaret's documentation was so professionally detailed that federal analysts had classified the threat level as requiring immediate tactical response. I showed Captain Wilson my federal EOD certification and explained the nature of my work. Captain, I'm a licensed explosive ordnance disposal specialist. The equipment and materials reported as suspicious are professional tools I use to safely dismantle explosive devices and protect people from explosive hazards. His expression shifted as he examined my credentials and compared them with the detailed technical reports that had triggered the federal investigation. Mr. Brooks, these reports contain accurate descriptions of explosive devices and safety protocols. Someone with professional knowledge documented potential threats. Captain, I believe those reports came from someone who's been trained to recognize explosive hazards by a military EOD specialist, but who's applying that knowledge to legitimate safety equipment because of personal trauma. The conversation that followed demonstrated the professionalism of federal agents who specialized in distinguishing between genuine threats and misunderstood legitimate activities. Agent Martinez reviewed my equipment storage, while explosive ordnance specialists verified that my demolition charges and safety protocols matched legitimate EOD operations rather than bomb-making activities. Mr. Brooks, Agent Martinez said after consulting with the EOD team, your equipment and procedures are consistent with professional explosive ordnance disposal rather than terrorist activities. However, the reports we received contained enough technical accuracy to warrant serious investigation. That's when Margaret appeared at her front door, watching 20 federal agents examine the equipment she'd reported as terrorist materials. Her face showed the complex mixture of vindication and growing concern of someone who'd been certain about the threat but was beginning to question whether she'd understood the situation correctly. Captain Wilson approached Margaret with the respectful authority of an officer addressing a concerned citizen whose reports had prompted legitimate investigation. Mrs. Stone, you're the community member who filed the federal threat assessment reports? Yes. I documented suspicious explosive materials and bomb-making activities, Margaret replied, her voice carrying the conviction of someone who'd followed proper protocols for reporting perceived threats. I have extensive documentation of dangerous explosive devices being stored and used in a residential area. Mrs. Stone, your reports demonstrate sophisticated understanding of explosive safety protocols. Where did you acquire this technical knowledge? Margaret's composed expression cracked as she realized the federal agents were questioning not just the threat she'd reported, but the expertise that had made her reports credible enough to trigger a terrorism investigation. My husband was an EOD specialist with the 82nd Airborne Division, she said quietly. He taught me to recognize explosive hazards so I could help protect our community from dangerous situations. The silence that followed was profound as everyone involved realized the emotional complexity of what had just unfolded. Margaret hadn't filed false terrorism reports. She'd used legitimate explosive safety knowledge to report what appeared to be genuine threats based on the technical training her deceased husband had provided. Agent Martinez approached Margaret with the professional empathy of an investigator who understood the difference between malicious false reporting and trauma-driven overprotection. Mrs. Stone, your husband was Staff Sergeant Michael Stone, killed by an IED in Afghanistan 5 years ago, Margaret whispered, tears beginning to flow as she realized that her efforts to protect the community had created exactly the kind of dangerous tactical situation that had killed her husband. Mrs. Stone, your reports were technically accurate and professionally documented. You followed legitimate protocols for reporting suspected explosive threats. The federal response was appropriate based on the evidence you provided. That's when I made the decision that would transform our neighborhood's understanding of both explosive safety and community trauma. Agent Martinez, I'd like to request permission to conduct an educational demonstration for Mrs. Stone and our community about the difference between explosive ordnance disposal and bomb-making activities. The demonstration that followed became an impromptu masterclass in explosive safety that helped Margaret understand how the equipment she'd feared was actually designed to protect people from the explosive hazards that had killed her husband. I started with the basics, explaining how EOD specialists approach unknown explosive devices with systematic caution designed to prevent rather than create detonations. Margaret, every piece of equipment you documented serves a protective function. We don't make explosions more dangerous. We make dangerous explosions controlled and safe. Using a small demonstration charge, I showed her how shaped charges are precisely calculated to direct explosive force in specific directions, minimizing collateral damage while achieving necessary demolition objectives. The mathematics involved in calculating explosive force distribution demonstrated the scientific precision required for safe EOD work. This is exactly the type of charge Michael used to clear roadside bombs. I explained. The difference between EOD work and bomb making isn't the equipment, it's the purpose and precision behind how it's used. I demonstrated how detonation timing systems allow EOD specialists to safely evacuate areas before controlled explosions, how protective barriers channel explosive force away from people and structures, and how each safety protocol serves multiple redundant protection functions. Margaret's technical questions revealed the depth of knowledge her husband had shared about explosive safety. She understood blast radius calculations, recognized different types of explosive compounds, and could identify safety equipment by its proper technical designation. Michael taught me to recognize these tools so I could help other military families understand the safety of EOD work, she said, tears flowing, as she realized how her knowledge had been twisted by trauma into seeing threats where protection existed. He always said EOD specialists were lifesavers, not life-takers. The demonstration attracted neighbors who'd been evacuated during the federal response. Families who'd spent the morning watching tactical teams secure their street now gathered to learn the difference between creating explosive safety and creating explosive terror. Margaret, every piece of equipment you documented serves the same mission your husband died fulfilling. I explained. We use controlled explosions to eliminate uncontrolled ones. We create small, safe detonations to prevent large dangerous ones. As Margaret examined my EOD equipment with new understanding, her technical knowledge became an asset rather than a source of fear. She could see how each tool served protective rather than destructive purposes, how every safety protocol was designed to minimize rather than maximize explosive damage. Michael always said that EOD work was about turning dangerous situations into safe ones, she said, running her fingers over equipment identical to what her husband had used. I thought you were creating danger, but you're actually preventing it. The community meeting that afternoon was unlike anything our neighborhood had ever experienced. Federal agents explained how legitimate safety concerns could trigger appropriate law enforcement responses, while EOD specialists described the difference between creating explosive threats and neutralizing them. Agent Martinez addressed the assembled residents with professional clarity about the investigation process. Mrs. Stone's reports contained technically accurate information about explosive materials and safety protocols. The federal response was appropriate based on the evidence documented and the potential risks assessed. The educational component became therapeutic for Margaret and revelatory for our community. Residents learned that the morning's tactical response hadn't been triggered by false reporting, but by legitimate safety concerns filtered through personal trauma that had shaped perception of explosive hazards. Margaret spoke to assembled residents about her husband's death and how losing an EOD specialist had shaped her perception of explosive safety. I thought I was protecting you from the same dangers that killed Michael. I didn't understand that Mr. Brooks is doing the same work Michael did, making dangerous situations safe. Her presentation included photographs of Michael in his EOD gear, documentation of his service record, and explanation of how military families learn to recognize explosive hazards as part of supporting their EOD specialists' mission. The audience began understanding how legitimate knowledge had been channeled through trauma into protective overreaction. Tom Rivera, our elderly neighbor who'd been evacuated that morning, stood up during the discussion period. Margaret, we appreciate your concern for our safety, but this morning was terrifying for our grandchildren who thought our neighborhood was under attack. The conversation that followed was delicate but necessary. Residents needed to process their own trauma from the federal response while supporting Margaret's healing journey and understanding the legitimate safety concerns that had triggered the investigation. Dr. Linda Hayes facilitated discussions about balancing community safety awareness with support for neighbors dealing with loss and trauma. Margaret's knowledge of explosive safety is valuable to your community, but it needs to be channeled through healing rather than fear, through cooperation rather than isolation. Margaret's knowledge of explosive safety is an asset to your community. Dr. Hayes explained, but that knowledge needs to be channeled through understanding rather than fear, through cooperation rather than isolation. 6 months later, Margaret and I had developed the most comprehensive community explosive safety program in our region. She used her technical knowledge to educate residents about legitimate safety concerns, while I provided professional expertise about actual explosive hazards versus perceived threats. Margaret established support networks for military families dealing with loss and trauma, while channeling her protective instincts into legitimate community safety coordination. Her understanding of explosive hazards, combined with her experience processing loss, made her uniquely qualified to help other families navigate similar challenges. Ethan helped me understand that Michael's death wasn't meaningless if I could use what he taught me to actually protect people. Margaret said during a regional conference on trauma, informed community safety. Instead of seeing explosive threats everywhere, I learned to recognize real safety concerns and respond appropriately. My pool removal project had become a workshop space where Margaret and I conducted explosive safety demonstrations for emergency responders, construction workers, and military families. The controlled demolition techniques that had triggered her initial fear became teaching tools for understanding how explosives could be used safely and protectively. The federal investigation results were used to develop training protocols for distinguishing between legitimate EOD activities and actual terrorist threats. Agent Martinez credited our case with improving federal response procedures for situations involving military families and professional explosive safety personnel. Captain Wilson established ongoing consultation relationships with both Margaret and me, recognizing that community-based explosive safety expertise could enhance law enforcement capabilities while preventing unnecessary tactical responses to legitimate professional activities. 2 years after the SWAT response, Margaret received recognition from the Department of Veterans Affairs for developing trauma-informed community safety programs that helped military families process loss while contributing to genuine public safety. The recognition ceremony became a celebration of transformation that honored both Michael's memory and Margaret's healing journey. Military families from across the region attended to witness how personal loss could be channeled into community protection that prevented others from experiencing unnecessary trauma. Your transformation of personal tragedy into community strength represents the highest values of military service. The VA citation read, "You've honored your husband's memory by preventing others from experiencing unnecessary loss while contributing to legitimate safety awareness." Margaret's acceptance speech moved the audience to tears as she described how learning to distinguish between creating safety and creating fear had allowed her to honor Michael's mission while healing her own trauma. Michael died protecting people from explosive hazards. I almost let my fear dishonor his memory by turning protection into paranoia. The ceremony included presentations from families who'd benefited from Margaret's safety programs, federal agents who'd learned from our case study, and military EOD specialists who recognized the unique challenges faced by families dealing with explosive-related loss. Captain Wilson, who'd led the original SWAT response, spoke about how the investigation had changed federal protocols for evaluating threat reports from military families. Mrs. Stone's case taught us that the most credible threat reports sometimes come from the people who understand explosive safety best, even when their understanding is shaped by personal loss. But the most meaningful recognition came from families in our community who'd learned to balance realistic safety awareness with support for neighbors dealing with trauma and loss. Our neighborhood had become a model for communities seeking to integrate military family expertise while maintaining genuine safety standards. Standing in my completed workshop, surrounded by EOD equipment that Margaret now recognized as tools for protecting rather than threatening our community, I realized that sometimes the most explosive situations can be diffused with understanding instead of more force. Margaret Stone had thought she was reporting a terrorist threat because she'd been trained by an EOD specialist to recognize explosive hazards, but she'd actually been protecting our community the same way her husband had protected his unit, by identifying potential dangers and taking action to neutralize them. The difference was learning to distinguish between creating explosive safety and creating explosive fear. And sometimes, it takes a SWAT response to teach a neighborhood that the most dangerous explosions are the ones that happen inside people's hearts when they're trying to prevent others from experiencing the loss they've endured. The workshop continues serving its original purpose, maintaining equipment that keeps people safe from explosive hazards. But it also serves a new purpose Margaret helped create, teaching communities how trauma can be transformed into protection, how loss can become legacy, and how even the most explosive misunderstandings can be safely diffused with professional competence and human compassion.